What's going on, everybody? This is Jake Adams coming to you from the Reef Builder Studio. We have a very special guest. We don't do guests very often on Reef Therapy, but I'm very proud to welcome a very good old friend, Mr. Steve Weast. How are you doing? You can shake my hand even though they won't see it.
Thank you, Jake, for having me. It's been really a pleasure to be invited to come and take a look at the studio and see what you have going on these days.
I really want to thank you for coming out. Your aquarium philosophy has, as you can see, been a real big influence on the studio. And when I told people that you were coming to visit, they were like, "He still has the tank? I thought he took it down." And so there's a lot of folks who remember who you are, who've been in the hobby industry for a long time. Your pictures of your tank are still circulating everywhere. And you and I stayed in touch. Talking reef stuff, even when you didn't have a reef. And I guess, for a lot of our listeners who might not be familiar with your background and your history in the aquarium hobby, tell us how you, I guess, first made your impact felt on the aquarium hobby in the form of your two aquariums featured on OregonReef.com?
Correct.
All right.
Yeah. First of all, I have to give a shout out to a very good friend of mine. His name is Pierre Artisan, and he is the one who is actually responsible for starting OregonReef.com. I had no ambitions of creating a website, but he insisted that I created a website, and I provided the content for him, and he says, "I'll create a website for you," and he did. And it's still active to this day, mostly because it auto-renews, and I haven't gotten around to stopping that yet. But it's still alive today, and surprisingly, it's still valid in today's world, in today's aquarium hobby. So I've kind of left it up there.
When I pulled it up, just to refresh my memory of some of the stuff you had up on there, it was like nostalgia, just going back to that website. But tell the listeners what are some of the things that they can see on that website. But really, let's just talk about your tanks, right? You had, how big is your tank? Is it 1,000-something gallons?
It was 850 gallons, and it was unique in that it was 6 feet by 8 feet by 30 inches tall. And what I did on that was a little bit unusual than what most people would do, even really a public aquarium would do. I made the built-in main viewing wall the short side. So it was a viewable panel of 6 feet, but a depth that you look through of 8 feet.
So kind of like a peninsula that you only look at in the end.
Correct. And what made it unique was that orientation, but not only that, but also the aquascaping, which was also set into a form of a canyon and almost with diverging walls on the side, which gave a perspective of even further depth. If you went around to the back wall and pulled off the panel and looked at it, you'd go, well, that's a lot shorter, because now it's the opposite view, short going fat. So it actually had a forced perspective to even make that 8 foot of depth seem a lot deeper.
So before we dive into that tank a little bit, did you have aquariums before that? Did you have some experience with reef tanks before that?
Prior to that, I had a smaller tank. It was 500 gallons that I first set up, and that would have been right around 2000. And it wasn't enough. It was conventional. I wanted something, and I had the ability, since this was inset into a garage and I was not constrained by space, I wanted to take that down and actually convert it every moved into the new tank, and made that tank basically the same 6 foot viewing panel, but now almost 3 times as deep going back. And that created all the difference in the world. That's what made it unique.
So you created your 1,000-gallon tank in a very different, environment of aquarium sophistication than we have today. A whole different subset of equipment, of techniques, of ideas. Besides, the forced perspective, I'm going to get into a little bit of the livestock of your classic reef tank. What was some of the equipment that you used? Because this is before LEDs, maybe even before like propeller pumps kind of took off. I don't even know if needle wheels were big enough for that kind of tank at the time.
No. At that time, everything was geared obviously for smaller tanks, so everything had to be kind of upsized for that, for this tank. So one thing was the lighting. Obviously, there's not going to be a light hood, a standard, anything for that size tank. So I had to get out the carpentry tools and make a light hood that would be sufficient for that entire tank. And if I remember right, I think it was 12 400-watt halides. It was 8 VHOs, and mostly was using a few 10K Ushios, a few 14K Phoenixes, and probably half of them was 20K Radiums. That was our lighting choice at the time.
You had 5,000 to 6,000 watts just in the halides.
Exactly.
Ooh, God, that must have been a hot tank.
Well,
Or, you know, just a lot of heat.
then you have a 2-horsepower chiller.
Did you have 1 2-horsepower or 2 1s?
I used 2.
I knew you weren't using one. I knew you're not using just one.
2 of the same chillers, but what I did is I had them offset by a temperature, so I can, over the months, which one is the dominant chiller, so they wear evenly over time.
How did you know to do that?
It's just a point of failure. If this because I generate so much heat and it can cook the tank in a heartbeat, I needed a redundancy that made me comfortable that if that chiller ceases operation for some reason, you know, I had a backup. Also,
so you have a kind of a non-destructive, it's like a safe fail-safe.
Correct.
Like a non-detrimental fail-safe, I guess
Yes.
is what I'm trying to say.
And it also gave me the ability, because those coils build up gunk on them over time, it also gave me the ability to take one offline without disturbing the tank and basically acid bath it on the inside, clean it all out, and put it back online.
All right, so we've talked about the lights, your classic chillers. What skimmer were you using? Was this about 2003, 2005?
Correct. We're talking the low 2000s, 2004-ish type thing. It was employing what at that time was state-of-the-art, and it was an external Deltec skimmer. It was basically a little mini R2D2 sitting in the corner that was surrounded by, fed by, I think it was like 4 Eheim 1262 pumps on them, and it did a great job. You know, it performed, it did the work. You know, but that was the state of the art. That type of equipment for larger systems was just coming available on the market for us. So
today, man, dosing pumps are everywhere, but I don't know that you did dosing for a tank like that. You must have had a calcium reactor.
Correct. Also had a Deltec calcium reactor, and that's it.
No calc, no dripping, no dosing. Did you do any manual dosing of certain things?
The product wasn't available. We didn't have that available. We relied upon the calcium reactors. So what we were doing at that time, or what I was doing at that time, is, I was testing for, the usual pH, temperature, salinity, alkalinity, nitrate, but that's pretty much it. We really the phosphate test kits even.
Yeah, ICP testing wasn't even like a blink on the horizon. It wasn't even a glimmer in anyone's eye.
No.
Not even close.
No.
All right, so what did you do for flow on your 4x6 foot tank?
Flow is a huge challenge, naturally, because I wanted it to be predominantly SPS, but it's still a mixed reef, so it had everything in there. So there's no doubt about that. But I had to hide the flow. It is completely offensive for me to see any kind of power heads, any kind of return jets, wires, hoses, any of that. Anything of man, I do not want to see in my display.
Let the record show that I tried really hard to hide 95% of all the equipment inside my tanks, and he still gave me some friction, it let me know his displeasure of being able to see the overflow teeth on the external drain boxes. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Sir Weast, but I did my best. But yeah, I do appreciate almost an obsessive attention to making your reef tank just totally unobtrusive. Like, I don't mind having a couple nozzles, but you've seen people pay zero attention to this, and it's like a Super Mario level inside your aquarium with all these pipes and hoses and nozzles everywhere, and it can really detract from the aquarium. So what did you do, or some of the techniques that you did to hide the flow, and then what was your flow provided by?
My flow at that time, our big primary pumps were external pumps. I believe they were called like Dolphin pumps.
Yeah.
They were the amp masters. They pulled 1 amp. They put out maybe 3,000 gallons an hour type
All
flow.
AC pumps, DC pumps are still not even...
not a thing yet.
Yeah.
Not an option for us. Nor was any controllability of these pumps at all. We couldn't ramp them up or down or anything else. None
So
of that
you
was
use
available.
Dolphin pumps in a closed loop?
in a closed loop.
How many loops did you have?
4, one for each pump. And so those were delivering, those 4, 3,000, and there was very little piping there to reduce that flow through friction losses through the piping. So I was getting probably a true 3,000, maybe slightly less.
From each one?
From each one.
No nozzles?
No nozzles.
No eductors, no penductors?
No, none of those things.
Trinkets or toys to adulterate the water flow?
No.
Just sheer volume and speed?
Correct. And those nozzles were incorporated into the rockwork, but completely obscured by the rockwork from the viewing panel. If you were to go up and look at the reef from the top, slide the light hood over for accessibility, look down, oh, there's nozzle 1, 2, 3, 4. Or if you go from the back of the unit, take off the rear viewing panel and look at it from the back from a maintenance access to clean the back panel or whatnot, it is a different aquarium. It is not show ready. That is not the point. Actually, I want to look at it and be able to visually check on things like that. It's just visually obscured from the viewing panel, but that doesn't mean not accessible.
How long did you have that tank running? Because I mean, there was a good slice of time where that was kind of a pinnacle reef, and that was everybody's inspiration. Everybody who kind of graduated up towards that level, and it inspired so many reef tanks for a long time. How long did you have that tank going?
I believe I finally took it down. I don't document the actual dates or anything else like that, but I'm going to guess somewhere around 2008-ish, somewhere around there, and where I kind of moved on a little bit from that part of the hobby and entered another segment of it into cold water reef keeping.
So that's another thing I want to touch upon is there's some folks who keep cold water animals, and by and large, I mean, it's mostly public institutions and researchers and people in the Pacific Northwest. But I think you're definitely unique in kind of bringing in a lot of reef philosophy to your cold water tank, and I know that inspired a whole wave of both cold water keeping and non-photosynthetic animal keeping. Tell us a little bit about your cold water tank.
First of all, I live in the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Oregon, and we have some of the most incredible diving opportunities up in the Puget Sound area. Not so much off the Oregon coast because we're open water there, but up in Puget Sound there are numerous fantastic dive sites. And when I dive those, I do scuba dive, and I go up there, I see a world that is so completely different and alien compared to our tropical warm water reef keeping, and nobody knows about it. Everybody's experience with a cold water tank is the lobster tank into the grocery store. They think it's bland, they think it's dull, they think it's great, and it's anything but it's hidden in the cold water world of those environments, and nobody knows about it. So I wanted to still create a system, although smaller, about half the size of the original, that showcased those animals and that life, still employing the same kind of artistic aquascaping techniques that I employed on my larger warm water one.
All right, so we're just going to give you a sneak peek. I don't have Mr. Weast here just to talk about the good old days, because he's got a new tank set up that has got some of us in the know really, really excited to learn more. We're going to only touch upon that, but in the meantime, I want to really get your feedback. So you took a long break. I visited you in Portland once or twice, and
drank all my beer, yeah. Okay.
And your cold water tank was just in your garage, and you were just always looking for the right time to set it up. So you were in a holding pattern for 10 years?
About a decade. Between some personal and job and other things, I was kind of out of the hobby, actively in the hobby. I never really left the hobby.
You
I always
and I,
kind of
we
kept the
talked
thumb
Reef
on it.
Periodically, we never missed a year.
Exactly. So it was about a decade, and I had my full cold water empty tank sitting there. Now, this tank was geared for cold water, so it's a little bit different in needs from warm water, but certainly can be modified slightly back to create a warm water reef. So I got tired of seeing the empty tank just growing spiders in there. I had everything. I never got rid of everything. All I needed to do was add water and I could start up again. So COVID hit and I decided, what the heck, I'm just going to go ahead and start up a reef again. And then I had to decide, what did I want to do?
So before you get into that, what was your impression of the aquarium hobby from the sidelines, right? You weren't really active on forums. You know, you and I probably stopped getting on bulletin boards at about the same time, but I know you were looking at stuff, probably picking up some magazines here and there, you know, seeing what was online. What was it like sort of being on the outside looking in?
A 10-year gap in that hobby was enormous. When I came back, before I kept a kind of a cursory, what is they, you know, peruse some of the message boards, what are they talking about these days? But when I fully came back and then really started deep diving, it was a different hobby for when I came back. Priorities changed, tanks changed, equipment changed, everything changed. It was very different. Some things for the better, many things not for the better, at least in my opinion, and some of the things that are important for me in the tank. So that kind of pushed me actually into a direction of not going back to cold water and collecting my own stuff and whatnot. I'm going to go back to my roots and create a mixed reef tank and see if I can't recreate on a smaller, more conventional sized tank maybe some inspiration that some of my old tanks garnered back in the day.
When Steve says a mixed reef tank, that is not the mixed reef tank that we're literally recording next to at this moment. His reef tanks create like a variety of different eco zones, and somehow you can prioritize the top space for your anemones and have acros just underneath. And I know that blows people's minds. You know, you got bommies and radarized, and this is something you did in your old tank and in your current tank, where they're at the top of the tank. And I know the reasons for it, but when you say a mixed reef, you have like little micro ecosystems and groupings of similar corals. It's not what other people say when they say a mixed reef tank. You know, I'm pointing around to the tanks. That's a mixed reef. That's a mixed reef. That's a mixed reef. But a Steve Weast mixed reef is a whole nother level. So, you know, we've gotten a lot more controllable with our pumps. A lot more smart features with lights, pumps, dosers, skimmers. And I know there's probably a lot of things you wished you could have done with your older tanks, but technology wasn't really practical to use at the time. So what were some of the improvements you were looking to make from your old tank to your new tank?
Two main areas that I deemed were fantastic improvements from what I had available to me in the early 2000s as to what I had now. And the one, lighting. I no longer had to bake the tank with metal halides. I now could do it with lighting. You now can have controllability of that lighting for ramping up, ramping down, controlling the spectrum. All of those were completely unavailable to us in that time. Our idea of ramping up was turning off the halides and leaving the VHOs on.
Pretty much, I think, towards, you know, the end of the heydays of the metal halides, there was a few controllable ballasts, manual control. There was a few ways to kind of control and ramp VHOs down to like 50 or 20%. But yeah, it's not even close to the orchestra of spectral colors that we can do now. It's like insane.
Yeah.
So,
and flow.
Yeah.
Flow is the other main component that changed. Before, I was limited to on and off, and that was it. Now I can have programmability on flow generation in the tank to create different environments, and really can create different environments really within the same tank with the controllability that we have now that was not available back then.
Before we kind of take a slightly deeper dive in some of your thoughts on the current state of the reef aquarium hobby, because I told people who know you that you were coming out, they all wanted to know your opinion, and I think you have the freedom to really say it like it is in a way that even I don't have, you know, as far as like, you know, coming across grumpy or critical. But before that, I just want to take a small detour because you have incredible experience with NPS corals, not only in your cold water aquarium, but within the zones of your reef tanks. It's every time I see that, I'm like, I can't do that. I'm not even gonna try. I'm gonna put all my NPS corals in their own little tank where I can really feed them and then manage nutrients later. But you manage to put them together in specific areas in your tank. So give us some tips on NPS coral care. And by NPS, I mean stony corals, you know, Tubostrea, Dendrophilia, the likes, within a reef system.
First of all, my cold water tank was the training ground for all of that. Since it was 100% non-photosynthetic, how much food does it take to keep these things going? How often do they really need to be fed to keep going? That was a huge learning curve that actually forced me to create a refrigerated, automatic dosing system to automatically feed it multiple times a day to keep things going. And a lot of it too is governed from my physical diving experiences, seeing what environment and what food was available. So now how that translates over into warm water. I can't replicate that system in the tropical tank because it's more of a target feeding issue on these. So I place my dendros and any NPS stony corals tropical in there. I try to put them where I'd put them in find them in their own environment. So we're talking shaded areas under overhangs, maybe in a cave, off to the far left, off to the far right that can be shaded. Algae is the enemy of those type of animals. They will get overrun with algae. A little bit of skeleton gets exposed, the algae will get on it and start it receding back. That is the biggest enemy against those animals. The other's feeding, and they like to come out at night, but we don't come out at night. So they can be trained to come out in the daytime. I do mine by just stirring up the sand a little bit or putting a little food in the water. That'll get them to come out, and then I target feed them. Target feeding them a variety of usually fresh, could be mysis, could be scallop, could be crushed LRS, could be a variety of ones, and they will gobble it down, and it works.
So in your experience, the stony NPS corals are not picky?
No, the food size that they will accept is not really different than the rest of the tank will take. So you're not doing anything different. Yeah, if they were carnation corals or something like that, I'm not even going to get involved with that. That would be an entirely different system that you would need.
I've tried and failed 4 or 5 times.
Everybody has.
I never even made any progress.
Everybody has.
Sometimes I thought I'd make progress, but that's why I'm like, all right, I'm okay playing with some, these stony corals. And
exactly.
You and I went to a wholesaler, picked one up yesterday.
Exactly.
Algae is really important to prevent, just for the life of the coral. I did notice that in your current tank and your older tanks, a lot of times you place the corals vertically. Is there any reason for that other than aesthetics? Does that prevent stuff like settling on them when you have them more vertical?
It doesn't necessarily. I am placing it, first of all, when I set up the tanks, it's purely for aesthetics. That is the overriding priority of me, is aesthetic. Everything else
functional aesthetics.
Functional aesthetics. I then have to overcome problems to allow that aesthetic to come through.
So in some ways you make it harder for you by where you place your corals and stuff?
Because the aesthetics are so important to me.
That shows. That really shows.
And in my current rendition, I wanted to do something a little different because of the aspect ratio of the tank and how it's working in an aquascaping. So I went with more of a balmy pinnacle design. And that's vertical aquascaping in and of itself. Vertical aquascaping on pinnacles. I no longer have horizontal surfaces that I am planting corals on. I am dealing with vertical surfaces.
All right. So now really getting kind of the meat of the discussion, and I'm going to let you talk until you go too far off the deep end. But people who know you really want to know what you think about some of this stuff. So let's just get it out of the way, man. What do you think about the current state of corals? And that could be the sizes, how people are viewing corals, the kind of subjective names. I'm just going to let you go off. Go for it, Steve.
Okay, so we are now going to dive into old man yelling at clouds. Okay, corals. It was a very different world back when I had my tank going in the mid-2000s. We were dealing, with the way we acquired corals. It used to be true colonies, reefer madness. Our local fish stores were getting full shipments of corals, a little bit different than today's environment.
It was a huge variety. So much diversity of corals, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So definitely the diversity has changed a little bit from that aspect of it. But it seems like the focus of the hobby has now gotten a lot smaller. I am now dealing with people who must have 100 millimeter macro lenses and really good vision to see the individual polyp on these corals, and that's what they're interested in. I have never been interested in that, ever. I am interested in the overall display of the aquarium. It is an artistic representation of nature. It is not natural. I don't like it when people say my tank looks natural. There's nothing natural about it. I've got corals from all over the world occupying a space that is 15 square feet. That is, you'll never find that in nature. It is an artistic representation of nature. So today's world has gotten away from that on their corals, and now we're looking at individual basically frags of corals and frags of frags, and what they sell now, tiny little boogers.
I'm starting to call those really, really small. I went boogers, and then I went shards, and now I'm at genetic sample.
And I don't understand it. It doesn't have to be that way. There actually is quite a bit of availability out there, not to have to go into that. So I don't understand the pricing of it, and I don't understand, it's basically become a world of
Pokemon.
Collect them all.
Gotta collect them all.
Gotta collect them all. And the macro lens size, nothing ever grows in anybody's tank anymore because it immediately gets fragged down. I have no understanding of that, and I have no interest in being persistent. It holds no interest in me to going down that road. But others do, and people find enjoyment in the hobby. It's just not my cup of tea.
I used to really rail against this obsession of getting every single strain, but seeing different height bubbles for different groups of corals happen, which you saw it happen, right? Remember when the first frag of Sunset Monopora, $400. The first frag of Watermelon Alien Eye, $400. Each of those set off a massive kind of scavenger hunt for the next big chalice or the next cool Monty. And we saw others rush in to kind of prospect these new and cool strains. And you and I have been doing this for a long time. I am happy to sit on the sidelines, let them, figure out what are the great strains, collect them, grow them to a point where you can't even, like a regular fish store, can't sell a big encrusted colony of Sunset Monopora. I'll come in there, I'll buy it. I'll buy the whole rock, no problem. So that's what I don't mind, letting the collectors do that. And then later on, once the availability or the supply is caught up with the demand, I'm here to clean up. I'm here to pick out, the ones that have stood the test of time. There's a million tenuous strains. The Walt Disney and the Home Wrecker, they're going to be around forever. They've, proven themselves to be awesome corals. So I used to rail against that a lot, but there is a good silver lining to it. But on the flip side, because everyone's just got this collectoritis, they're not experiencing the extra levels and dimensions of coral growth. Like yesterday, we were at Aquatic Art in front of Chris Capp's tank, looking at his 3 foot by 2 foot Jedi mind trick, and it's got like mountains and hills in the center with just all these polyps, and it looks so cool, and people are really missing that, the extra layers of growth forms on their corals.
Absolutely. And a perfect example of this kind of collect them all mentality going on today. My local fish store recently brought in a large shipment of mariculture tenuises. I was like, how are you possibly going to move all those? They moved in a day, and they were nothing to write home about, but they were a live tenuis. And then it dawned on me, people are buying these as spec corals, all looking for the next Angry Bird. They weren't growing it for their tank or anything else. This is somebody trying to find, they were basically panning for gold.
Panning for gold, that's right.
And that really took me back, going, okay, that's where a big segment of this hobby has moved to. It has moved away from the artistic representation of the tank and what a coral can be rather than what it is in its infancy.
On the flip side, everyone's trying to get a piece of that weeping willow leather coral, which is a brown sarcophyton, which is kind of cool. It's not that like they're going to find other varieties of it. So, there's some appreciation for oddball, brown leather corals, which really kind of surprises me. But you did a really commendable job not being too cranky about the state of corals. I'm surprised. I guess we kind of got it out of our system yesterday a little bit.
Wait till we get to aquascaping.
Yeah. Oh, God. All right. Okay. Well, I'm going to save that one for a little bit later. we'll do a TikTok, right? So like, something that's a little grumpy and something that you might like better. So for the next one, the landscape of aquarium equipment has changed a lot. We are both, simple reefers. We're both gearheads, but we like gear that we can really trust, and that's going to provide a fundamental function. What are some of your favorite new reef toys?
Really, I only could come up with two that I think are incredible improvements, and we've already discussed that. One, lighting, and one on pumps and flows, and that also includes, pumps and flows for skimmers and associated thing. There's some interesting now advents coming along with the filter rolls and whatnot. I'm still a little old school and are mechanically filtering like I did kind of in the old days, because it worked then and it works now. Doesn't mean I wouldn't be open to moving to something else. But I've never been putting on gear for the sake of putting on gear. My tanks have always been very simply run. Anybody can come into and look at my system and immediately recognize what's going on and how it's all working, and not having to follow the yellow brick road down the line. Where's this going? Where's this going? How's this running? It's minimal plumbing.
No colored PVC?
No colored PVC.
No crazy water level sensors all over the place? No automatic water testing?
Well, it is a $1 float switch, so yeah, it's...
Float switch or float valve?
Float valve, yeah.
Okay. And then, do you use or enable some of the dynamic lighting that you use with your current lights?
Oh, absolutely. Those are incredible improvements, using what's available to us from a lighting, from changing the spectrum, from ramping it up and down, to changing it on a dime. You want to photograph, let's change the lighting so it's maybe not visually appealing, but it can for our photography if we want to take a picture of something. Those are, and all done from our phone. That's incredible. But to me, that's where the advances are. Controllers, never been a fan of controllers. I still see minimal use for them other than monitoring. I do not believe in automation from that standpoint, and it seems like the hobby has grown for automation for the sake of automation, and I think they're actually putting themselves at risk. And there's a good portion of the hobby who's, I think, more interested in the equipment than they are in what they've created for their display.
And I again, this is one of those things that I used to get really grumpy about. Like, no, this is a way to do it. But I also recognize there are some people who have a reef tank to have all the toys on there. Like, they're into the toys, and the reef tank is just kind of a reason, just something to do.
Absolutely, and that's evident if you look on some of the message boards. I was on the one on the other day, and a tank that was similar to my size. Oh, let's take a look, see what he's doing, because it's 50 pages long. I go, I'll just go to say 50 and see what it looks like. Turn to page 50, there's still not any water in the tank.
It's like a year going, year and a half? How long is the build?
I lost patience at that point. I'm done. It's done with that one.
I've been saying for last few years that there's almost a negative correlation between how much equipment somebody puts on an aquarium and how nice the tank display actually looks. And your previous and current tanks kind of embody that, right? Because if somebody saw your tank, just the display part, they would think that you would have such a complex, sophisticated system, and equipment like overload. But you have lights, you have in-tank flow, through-tank flow, skimmer, and a little bit of monitoring. Anything else?
No, and the world has changed to, it used to be that we had that equipment to keep a tank, and I think a lot of people's focus now is they have a tank so they can have their equipment. And that focus is on their equipment and not on their tank. My focus has always been on my tank, not my equipment.
One toy that I know you're going to love, it's not out yet, is the automatic frozen fish food feeder. It's been in development for like 2 or 3 years. I think it's going to be dropping like later this summer. It started as just like a cold storage carousel on top of your tank, which you would freaking hate, and now it's turned into kind of basically a dispenser that'll sit underneath your tank and it'll pump food up to your tank, and it's gonna be like $300. And it's really well thought out. No wireless functions or whatever. There's a little touch screen.
Able to defrost the food and dispense it, is what you're saying.
It keeps it in a cold saltwater slurry for up to like 3 weeks or something. The way you feed, that's probably going to be about a week.
Or an hour and a half, yeah, exactly.
It'll probably be a week's worth.
There's no doubt we all overfeed, but I'm the poster child.
So I know we've got our ways of reefing, and so you've got your fundamentals kind of locked in. But are there some toys that you're kind of curious about? You mentioned the automatic filter roll a little bit.
Correct. Right now I'm still old school and I'm filtering kind of, through a couple filter socks, and the old running through some filter floss and of course skimmers and maybe a couple intake sponges that you can take out and rinse off. Kind of a multifaceted approach that I did on my old tank. I even stir up my sand once a week with a diatomaceous filter just hanging on the outside to really give it a good cleaning because, sand is...
Let's put a pin in that real quick. So even though you're definitely an old school reefer, you don't mind new school versions of old school products because you're using new lights and you're using a new calcium reactor, correct?
Absolutely. The latest calcium reactor I'm using, which is a Deltec Twin Tech, that is the best thing since sliced bread. I no longer am counting bubbles. I'm no longer checking effluent. I'm just dialing up how much is going in or how much I want to pull back. And I just need to monitor my alkalinity and let that thing just keep on running. I never touch it. Maybe every 6 months, go ahead and break it down, clean it out, recharge it, start again. So, which I did actually just recently last month. It only took a few minutes. Done deal. It's good for another 6 months. See you at Christmas time,
Out of personal curiosity, what kind of media are you using in your Twin Tech?
Well, the choices in our old day was the old arm and whatnot. So right now we're using Julian's Reborn. Seems to work pretty well without turning to mush, but also needing a high pH or a really low pH to melt. So it seems to be working so far with using the Reborn. That is one thing. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of choices out there, but just typical Reborn is working for me. And it has some dolomite in there, also for magnesium.
So one thing that was really interesting is, you see that none of my tanks have a sand bed.
Correct.
I wish I could put sand in some of the tanks aesthetically without paying the piper the cost and all of the drawbacks of having a sand bed. And you have to have a sand bed because aesthetics is super important to you, but you also recognize how much of a liability the sand bed is, and you have a crazy sand bed maintenance routine or approach. Tell us about what is your relationship to the substrate in your aquarium?
Sand to me is one of the most important things in the tank visually. To create that artistic representation I want to create, it's got to have the sand. It's a visual break, it accents corals, what you're doing there. It's an important part of it. I've never been diving on a glass bottom, so I don't want to see that at all. So I need the sand in here, but I'm perfectly aware it comes with a boatload of baggage. And you really, really have to deal with it. If you don't, it's going to take you down. So the way I deal with it...
Let's just say that one more time. You have sand purely for aesthetics, and you believe that without proper precaution, it's going to bring down your tank.
Yes.
Explain.
It is nothing but a nutrient sink that will release into the tank. It is possible a vector for ick and the ick life cycle. I overcome that with a crap load of UV. I do not have any ick in my tank, but I guarantee you ick is in my tank because I have sand. It is in there. I know it's in there, but I have to control it. So those are the things I have to change my maintenance routine to offset the negatives of sand. I stir my sand nearly every day, maybe 3 or 4 times a week, let's say. And so when I stir it up, it's not like the whole tank is cloudy because I do it so often.
And just to clarify, you don't have sand in the back of the tank.
I only have sand in visible areas. Remember, I'm creating an aquascape for my eye. If I can't see it, it's not going there. In fact, usually under and behind rocks, I'm putting flow to make sure nothing accumulates back there. No detritus, no nothing could go back there. If you look at my tank from up above, drop down, you will see glass bottom in areas that are not visible to the viewing panel.
So what would you say to reefers who would say to you, oh, why don't you just have a big cleanup crew for your sand bed? Have some sand sifting gobies, some sand sifting starfish. Why don't you just do that?
There is no better cleanup crew than yourself. Cleanup crews are fine. Snails can eat algae. Yes, hermit crabs can run around and knock things over. Nothing can equate what you can do in minutes that they could do maybe in weeks, and maybe not to the extent. You can put all the sand sifting gobies you have in there. You are the best you are the best cleanup cook.
It's kind of a hope and a prayer when people put a just small amount of sand sifting starfish and some Nosarius and think that they're going to have that real reliable turnover of the sand bed.
No, it's just ridiculous. All it is an excuse not to do it yourself. You're being lazy, and if that is something you can't do, you shouldn't have the sand in the first place. Go bare bottom and go flow and change what's important to you. For me, it's visual, artistic representation of the tank, and I am going to do everything I can do to solve the negatives of it. But if I weren't doing that, if I say, I can't do this every day, I can't do that sand's going to get vacuumed out, because its negative aspects will take everything down eventually.
I feel like it's just a really refreshing to hear from someone who's just so visually driven, when it comes to reef tanks, that you have your sand bed, but you also know the costs and the drawbacks associated with that. So that's
Absolutely.
a really refreshing point of view. You still want to do your sand bed, but like sand sifting automation, even if it's biological, it's nothing compared to just doing it manually. So how do you stir your sand bed? A base stir? Do you have one of those 3D printed sand stirrers?
No. I just have an old-fashioned Kent scraper. I go down there, or I just reach down to the bottom of my hand. And once a week, I really get down there with my hand and fluff up all the sand.
And you keep nothing on the sand bed. That's another thing that kind of like I have to pay attention to when I'm looking at pictures of your tank. I auditioned a bunch of corals in the bottom of my tank, but a lot of people keep a lot of animals on their sand bed. Your sand bed is sand. That is what it's for.
Correct. And if I come in and I see a tank with a bunch of soldier rows of frags and clams and everything sitting on the sand bed, to me, I have a whole different opinion of the whole tank immediately. I can't stop looking at it. It's a negative. It is a big zit on the Mona Lisa. I can't tolerate it. I don't see that when I go diving. When I go and look at Maxima clams in the South Pacific, they're buried into the rock. They're not lined up as soldier rows on the sand. Same with frags. You'd never see a frag rack. I'm not a frag farmer. All those things is basically visual pollution to me.
It's really nice. It's interesting. This is a audio format, so no one can see your aquarium. Definitely go to OregonReef.com and see some of the concepts that we're talking about. But now that we're touching on aesthetics, I feel like there's a lot of lip service being paid to aquascaping. A lot of people talking about it, and people coming up with really, dramatic rockscapes. But then when it's time to put the corals on there, there's a very low, success rate at achieving, something that even gets close to what the freshwater guys are doing. So now this is the biggest can of worms. We're letting basically the judge of judges tell us what he thinks about the current state of aquascaping and the reef hobby, and go.
Absolutely. I would say that this is probably was the most shocking change for me, basically taking a hiatus for 10 years. When I left the hobby, the term negative space aquascaping was actually an important term. A couple of good friends of mine, Paul Whitley and Scott Fellman, actually gave pretty good MACNA representations on the use of negative space aquascaping. And back then, what that meant was not having a rock wall, allowing the eye to rest, maybe using composition themes like the rule of thirds in how you present your tank, not filling up every space.
And a clean sand bed helps with that.
And a clean sand bed not only gives you that visual break, it also reflects some light, maybe give you a little bit more brightness and lighting that the eye appreciates. And that's when I left the hobby we were moving towards. And then I come back into the hobby 10 years later.
When was this?
Well, just recently, a year ago. My current tank has been set up for about 14 months. So we're talking, setting it up late 2020 is when I was putting water in my tank. December of 2020 is when I was filling up my tank again. And I come back and I see threads on negative space aquascaping. And I click on it and I look at it and expecting to see where it has moved. And the whole really important artistic concepts of negative space aquascaping that we had back in the early 2000s has now been completely hijacked to refer to small rocks being glued together in the shape of balloon animals. I don't understand it at all. You take those now Granted, artistic little creations in there that are not representative really of anything in nature, and all you do is, unless you just have something encrust on it like zoos or something, you're going to lose all of that detail immediately when anything grows. Provides no cover for the fish. To me, it's a poor. Now everybody has their cup of tea and all, but for me, it's visually it's distracting and not interesting at all.
I have seen a lot more of these balloon animal shaped rock trees than I have actually seen aquascapes using, or, like live and functional with corals on them. I've only seen like a handful that were covered with corals and they weren't matured out, but it wasn't a great look to start.
Yeah, and that has actually transitioned over away from, let's just call them the balloon animals things, into little other aspects. I was perusing, it was an international site not too long ago, it might have been a New Zealand site I was looking at, but anyway, there was a typical start of a thread, and it was this guy had a 60-gallon cube. Very typical thing there, and he's saying, okay, this is my first shot at aquascaping the tank. What do you think? I'm trying to employ some of the negative space aquascaping. I go, okay, this is interesting. Let's click on it and see what it is there. And he had his tank there. And what he had on there is a couple rocks on the left piled on top of each other, and one big rock on the right. And then he had what is now kind of the flat shelf rock plates sitting on top. And I was looking at it and going, okay, now I want to read the comments. And here come the comments, which the message board's a little bit of an echo chamber. The old nice tank, good start, lots of space for the coral. And I'm thinking, not a good start, not nice at all. It's basically an homage to, well, Stonehenge. It looks like Stonehenge. What are you doing? That is awful. Why aren't people giving them a little bit more artistic suggestions going through? If I were offering that, and had to use those same rocks that he was using, I would have taken the flat rock, I would have put it onto the base, I would have taken his substrate, softened the edges, piled on, made a little column on the right, as into the rule of thirds, shifted over to the right, and that would be an artistic pleasing and provide you enough ample space to put on corals and everything else grow, rather than Stonehenge.
I recently had my own kind of epiphany about aquascaping with rock, and it kind of blew my mind just after the fact. Everybody's using the same kind of rock, one kind of rock, right? And it's funny, you just look at the old pages where you had the regular, Bucani rock, real nice and porous. Then, you'd have some actual branch rock and some shelf rock, but these are made by different corals, and it really introduced a degree of heterogeneity to the aquarium. But I'll tell you what, man, when you just use only carib sea, or only real reef, or only cornerstone, or only maraca, you get only one kind of look. Or if you only use one kind of marco.
Very true.
And so we haven't really had a chance to look at the 400 yet, but I used 3 types of rock, and as soon as I backed out, and there's different colors, textures, shapes, I'm like, oh my God, this is way more natural looking just out the gate. And so that's one thing I really hope people will consider more with their aquascapes. It's like, don't get one type of rock. Yes, I know the manufacturer wants you to buy a single 50 or 60 pound box at a time, but when you mix and match these rocks, all right, there might be a little disconnect between some of them, but that's actually so much more natural, because a natural reef, wild reef, is made by all different kinds of coral. So use the same kind of rock. It's like showing me a reef that's built only with one kind of coral, and that's the exception, not the rule.
You're absolutely right. And my current system utilizes 3 or 4 different types of rock.
All right, this question's for Keith, even though he doesn't know he asked it. Did you use wild rock? Did you use live rock? Did you use dry rock? What was your rock recipe?
So again, I'm going for the visual artistic representation, and I need to create bommies. And I also need to hide plumbing and everything that I normally do on there. So I used it all, basically. So I have Puget Sound rock that is left over from my cold water system, which were basically huge basalt, solid, non-porous boulders, but the shapes were really interesting, and I utilized those. And I also put in a few shelf rocks that I used to create some vertical spaces on the end of it. And I used a little KP Aquatic live rock to kind of seed the tank and create some little different textures. And I used a little bit of dry rock. So it has a combination of all of them, all in the goal of creating an interesting rock space in the aquarium. It's all from an artistic standpoint. And that's what differs a little bit that I do that most people don't. If I'm creating a tank, it's going to look good day one. And that means a lot of rock. But that doesn't mean it's going to stay a lot of rock. As corals grow, as there's new acquisitions, corals go in, rock comes out. I've recently been, now that the tank is over a year old and corals are growing in, it's time to start kind of re-aquascaping a little bit. Out comes rock, corals are changing and becoming more dominant. But I'm not going to look at a tank that, wow, this tank's going to look really good 3 years from now. That is not me. It's going to look good today. And all I have to deal with is rock. But it will change.
You would be so good at aquarium service. Not taking care of other people's tanks, but just like setting out the vision, making it look awesome from day one. But what you are proposing is very hands-on. You know, it's something that you have to massage and manicure as the tank progresses. And before you touch on that, your rocks have a lot of, your rockscape has a lot of verticality.
Correct.
Right? It's got, without being a rock wall.
Correct.
Without being a stack.
Correct.
You know, do you use any kind of like pegs or stakes or mortar to kind of keep things together, or epoxy, or do you just, kind of secure fit?
I use the base of, basically it has 3 major pinnacle columns in there, and I used my Puget Sound rock, which was so heavy. Once you get it in there, it won't budge. And before I put it in, I basically took my concrete saw, cut off the bottom flat so it sits completely flat on the bottom. So there's no movement, there's no chance of falling, there's no nothing. And now I build upon those. And I do use epoxy. I'll mix epoxy and then mix it with a little cyanoacrylate, and that works great, especially on rocks that have little crevices that you can squeeze the epoxy into and let it cure. And it works just fine, and it also gives you the ability to break it apart later if you want, which is what I do to remove.
Yeah, it's not forever, right?
Exactly.
So you can always just do some demolition a little bit.
So a lot of folks, and I don't understand this, but a lot of the aquascaping these days are, wow, it's great, you have a lot of room for things to grow into, and it's like, I don't understand that. Why are we setting up something now that isn't going to look good for 3 years from now? Or why people have the fear of taking their rockery and rockscape close to, or maybe even breaching the surface. Go diving, you see that all the time. Why are we stuck with rock that, it can only be 1/3 of the height of the tank? No, it doesn't. Take it up to the top. Have it sticking out of the tank.
Are there any kind of fundamental points you want to touch upon the current state of the reef aquarium hobby before we tease them about your tank a little bit?
I will say that the hobby has diversified into niches within the hobby that we didn't have years ago.
Niches within niches. It really reminds me of freshwater, where if you're into cichlids, that doesn't mean you're into the same cichlids as the other guy, right?
Exactly.
Even if you're into African cichlids, you might be segmented based on Malawi and Tanganyika. If you keep angelfish, you're not necessarily talking to the discus keepers. And now we're seeing some of that with zoanthids, LPS, Euphilia, even acros. Some people, really do the collector stuff. Some people do the corals that grow into nice colonies. So yeah, definitely notice that. Definitely
different aspects of it, and more power to them. If that's what you enjoy in the hobby, that's fine. Everything that I enjoy of the hobby, which is based on, again, artistic representation of the whole display, is not even relevant to the frag farmer, the frag guy, who's more interested in just looking at individual corals. Sand is irrelevant. You'd never put sand in a frag tank. It's completely irrelevant. They're fine looking at the small individual corals. Great. If that's what you get out of the hobby, that's fine. If you like having your apex being able to basically do your laundry, fine. More power to you. Your tank may suffer, but maybe that's not important to you.
One thing that's super awesome about your current reef tank is that with just a few exceptions, everything in there are fish and corals that have been available for decades, right? There's nothing designer in your tank that is used as a crutch. You're really painting with colors and shapes and contrast, but there's nothing wild about it. I know you got some green goblin and acro. That's a kind of one of the newer strains, but like everything else is super classic. But what are some of the newer corals or even strains, or what are some of the things that have caught your eye?
Okay, well, first off, that concept has never changed me. Even back in the day, there was nothing unusual about or designer about my old aquarium. It was Bali green slimers and Oregon tord and just ordinary corals that we have. What was different is how I placed them together. I used complementary colors, textures, shapes, growth patterns to create that artistic design that appeals to the human eye. And that's still moving forward today. So it's still filled with corals that are really important to me via either shape, texture, color, growth patterns, everything, and how they interplay with one another. If you have, I have a perfect example where I came across I was able to buy from a tank breakdown, a nice mica stylo. And I thought, where am I going to put this? I go, oh, my green slimer really needs a backdrop. Purple and green together really play off each other. So I created a spot specifically for it, right behind now becoming a healthy, good-sized colony of green slimer. And they play off each other and complement each other. So what I'm always looking for in corals is interesting colors, textures, and like you mentioned, the Anacophora, a fast-growing coral, but that bright green color pop to help offset reds and blues and oranges really come into play in creating that artistic vision.
Any other corals that you've seen out in the, maybe interwebs that you're interested in adding to your collection?
A lot of it these days is focused on, again, the individual polyp-colored tenuouses and how that's going. And if I have to use a magnifying glass to see it, I have no interest in it. I want to see when it's actually a colony that I can see walking past the aquarium. So I've always been interested in, the staghorns and some of those type things. And LPS. I have a lot of LPS. I never was into Scalemia. They looked like basically a doorknob collection to me. I mean...
But you have a few clusters in your
But I
tank.
have them, and I've become converted on them because I found a purpose for them. They are the perfect little color spot you can put in that dark corner to help give a little color pop and interest in there, and the variation of colors in them are really interesting without having to get out a magnifying glass. So I've been converted on those, and I actually have 5 or 6 in there, specifically spot in there. It's like, that's a good spot for a Scalemia. Now I need to find one, and it kind of needs to be predominantly green because I have too much red around it. Let me now go hunting for a green Scalemia. So, and we all like to shop and whatnot, but I always have to, when I look for a coral and shop for a coral, always have to take into account where am I going to put it, how will it look, what its requirements are. If like, wow, my only spot I have is a high flow and I need something green, okay, I better be looking for a Humulus or a Gemmificara, something like that. So you take into account all of the coral needs under the overriding umbrella of how's it all going to look in the end.
Man, this has been such an awesome discussion with you. It's really cool to get your feedback and to indoctrinate a new generation with some of these classical ideas, because that's the thing, there's a lot of experimentation with corals, with equipment, with NSAs, and I have faith that some people will keep going down those alleys and those rabbit holes, but taken all together collectively, I think it will empower current and future generations of reefers to create even better and nicer displays. I'm still kind of flabbergasted that your current reef tank, there's something about it. There's a touch, there's a signature that you have that really, it looks like the little brother of your older tank, and I can't wait to go out to Oregon and see your tank and maybe do another podcast with you, another session of reef therapy, really just diving into your tank with some accompanying videos. But can you give people just a little taste of what they might expect on a future update about your aquarium equipment-wise, aquascape-wise, coral-wise?
This one, like I said, employs, it's more conventionally shaped, first of all. This is not like it was before, 8 feet by 6 feet, a monster tank. It's about 400 gallons. It measures about 86, 36, and then 30 inches high. And I like to call it a semi-peninsula, only because all of the overflow and all is all at one end of the aquarium, and it's viewable on 2 sides. And it employs a lot of the same techniques. You will not see a single power head. You will not see a return jet. You will not see a wire. You will not see a frag rack. You will not see soldier rows on the sand. All the same things employed on there are applicable in this tank. And it's employing more of a vertical aquascaping rather than rock on the ground. So there's a lot of open space on the sand bed for fish to swim around through, and the rock work still has tunnels, caves, accesses, also for flow to get through and around, and for access for cleaning and monitoring. They serve dual purposes. And probably most importantly to me, a absolutely clean tank on the glass, and that's all sides of the glass. You will not see a speck of coralline algae or any other algae on there, because, I mean, even today's world of the coral online reefers, they found the value of putting a black background against their corals to show it off, to sell it.
Really make it pop. Yeah.
No different than our tanks. I am not going to have a coralline filled back. That's lazy. It's a terrible background.
I'm over here. We're literally sitting in front of my tanks, which are coralline covered black backgrounds. They look mostly dark. You know, they're not overgrown, but now I'm ashamed.
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, I clean it, and I kept the aquascaping off of the glass to make it easily acceptable with just a mop. Just takes me a second to mop it down with my little Kent scraper and call it good, and keep it under control. I never let it get out of hand, because it's so important to offset and accentuate all the corals that you're growing in your tank.
All right, so one last thing, man. We cannot have this sit down without you telling people how you're using an Ecotech Marine Vectra pumps as freaking power heads. And then but you don't see them, so they're like power heads. They're kind of like an internal loop, so it's not even a closed loop, but it's kind of the same thing. Can you describe how you're using your Vectra pumps inside your tank?
Okay, so like I said before, think of this tank, it's hard to do obviously in an audio format. Think of it as a peninsula tank, and a typical peninsula tank has its overflow on the short opposite end. And that's where people are trying and struggling to get flow around. When you have that overflow on that side, generally on most tanks, like you even have here in the studio, you create a space on either side of that overflow, like a little alcove. Well, to me, that's wasted space. When I had this tank built for my cold water aquarium, because it employed the same technique, those alcoves were actually walled off by a kind of, let's say, a coast-to-coast wall. The overflow is still set in the center, but now I have two basically boxes on either side of them. I then had a big intake screen put in the bottom of it, and above it an outflow. So in there, I now can put very large, let's just call them power heads, even though they're pumps. I'm using them as a power head. And there's no piping or anything else on it. That whole vector just sits in the box there. It's outflow, take off the union fitting, just stick it out the hole there, which is on the tank side completely obscured by rock work and holes through the rock work that it jets the water out through. And that allows me also to gimbal it left, right, up, down. And I have 3 of them that are providing that completely hidden flow, because it's not viewable at all from the tank. And my flow, a lot of people on the peninsulas are going for more circular flow, left, right. Mine doesn't. Mine's up, down, up, down. So my circulation is real high to the top, especially for my high flow things that I want. Ritterei anemone, Gigantean anemone, SPS. Those guys are in really high choppy flow. Water hits that back wall, circulates back around, sucks back down around back to those intake pumps, and it keeps going and going and going.
No nozzles, conductors,
nothing.
RFGs, just a pure nozzle.
Just a pure, take off the union fitting off the end of the Vectra and stick it in the hole.
Oh man,
Jake saw a couple pictures of the flow, and it's actually quite a bit of flow, and I'm not even running them at 100%. And I put them on a closed loop on a Mobius and put them on Reef Crest, so they're
closed loop setting,
closed loop setting, so that they are modulating their flow, and 3 of them are independent, and when they get in sync sometimes it can be quite the little flow going through there, or kind of quiet if they ever get synced together on the low flow. So it's a random flow being generated in there, and it is significant in there to keep all these different animals.
Steve, I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you so much for sitting down with us and just giving some fresh perspective to the listeners. You know, I know the reef therapy audience is a very engaged one. You know, they're really here to learn, and I really appreciate you just kind of offering some kind of new ideas and some new approaches to things. So yeah, man, thanks for coming out.
Yeah.
I'll come out to Oregon in a few months.
Yeah,
and check
looking
out your
forward to
tank.
it. I think you'll maybe see something different and something that's not being addressed or done. So
Yeah, and yeah, man, we'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah.
Thanks to everybody for listening. I hope you enjoyed this power-packed, shorter session of Reef Therapy, and we'll catch you guys on another one very soon.